Nature and Form of Sales, Chapter 22. In this chapter, we're going to discuss how to form a sales contract under the UCC. General principles. Contracts for the sale of services in real estate, i.e. real property, are governed by the common law. Contracts for the sale of goods, which is tangible personal property, is governed by Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code, also known as the UCC. You can find the UCC in the back of your textbook. The UCC does not apply to securities or intellectual property. So now we're going to talk about the crux of the business transaction, a sale. Under the UCC, a sale of goods is a transfer of title of tangible personal property for a price. So it's the transfer of title to personal property for a price. Given that definition, we know that the following are not sales. A bailment. Why is a bailment not a sale? Because under a bailment, the bailor is delivering their personal property into the possession of another with an agreement that it will be returned, or with an agreement that the property might be stored or transported. But you are not selling your property to the bailee when you engage a bailment contract. When you put a bailment contract together, you are not selling that property to the carrier or the warehouser or the hotel. A gift is also not a sale. We learned what is a gift is the donative intent, so the intent to give, and then delivery of the property. Missing from that definition is anything about a price. So gifts are not sales. And services contracts are not considered a sale under the UCC. Services contracts, that's when you are being paid to provide a service rather than to actually give a good. Teaching is a service. Practicing law is a service. Mechanics are providing services. Dentists, doctors, stylists, barbers, they are all selling services, personal services, which form the basis of a contract, but they're just not governed by the UCC. You're going to use common law principles when you are dealing with contracts for services. But what if you have a contract that combines both services and goods? The prime example is that mechanic I mentioned, right? When you go to a mechanic, often there is a combination of services and goods taking place. If you've got a contract that consists of both services and goods, you're going to classify that contract according to what's dominant. What's the dominant element? If the contract is primarily about the service, then you're going to apply common law principles to any dispute. If the dispute is primarily about the goods that are being supplied in the contract, then you're going to use the UCC to resolve the dispute. So how do we determine which one is the predominant? Well, we use a test where we look at the relative cost of each part of the contract. So the test to determine whether the contract is primarily about goods and services is to look at which is predominant, and in order to determine which is predominant, you usually are going to use the relative cost of the items in the service to figure out which one governs. For example, if you're taking your car to get new brakes, you're going to get the service of installing the brakes, and you're also going to pay for the new brakes, which is a good or personal property. If there is a dispute as to that surfaces around the brakes and you want to sue and you're wondering, will I be able to use common contract law principles, or am I going to use the UCC? And we'll talk about later why, as the customer, you would probably like to use the UCC because you're going to get more protection. But we'll get to that later in later chapters. You would pull out your bill and see which one did you pay more for. And typically with mechanics, the labor cost is far more than the actual cost of the goods, the parts that are being installed. And if that's the case, using that kind of test with the cost, then the common law would apply to the contract. And if you don't like the brakes and how they're operating in your car, you're going to have to sue the mechanic using general common law contract principles. If the brakes perchance cost more than the labor to install them, then you could use the UCC. So what's happening in our sales contract? So let's look at our picture, right? We use our carrier to get our goods to our buyer. Our buyer here is Target, so they're a buyer and they're a retailer. And I always like to talk about Samsung. So Samsung is my seller, and they are having these cases delivered to their buyer, right? So retailers like, I'm going to take 10 cases. The buyer says that's going to be $10,000. That's a transfer of title of personal property, the cell phones, for a price, $10,000. That's your classic contract. Contracts that are sales contracts are governed by the UCC. They recall that the Uniform Commercial Code is a uniform state law. This means that everybody doing business in every state in the United States is going to be applying the same law. That's why we like uniform state laws, so that we can have consistency. If we're engaged in interstate commerce, we want the laws to be the same everywhere we are selling. Now, uniform state laws don't necessarily apply in every state. They apply to every state that has chosen to adopt the uniform state law. And as it turns out, every state has adopted the UCC. So it is applicable everywhere. And this makes business easier to transact, more predictable, and we don't have to worry that the contract law as it relates to sales of goods in West Virginia might be different than North Carolina. It's not going to be. It's going to be, because they're all going to be singing from the same sheet of music, with the UCC being that music. So how do we form a contract under the UCC? Now, I want you to continually think about and contrast the UCC with what you learned in legal environment, the common law. So under the UCC, to form a sales contract is really easy. Really easy. So long as the parties intend to form a contract, they can form one as long as they have two things: the subject matter and quantity. That's all the UCC requires to form a contract: subject matter and quantity. Recall, under common law, you had to have the intent to enter the contract, you had to have definiteness, and it had to be communicated to the offeree. And definiteness is the piece that is kind of being challenged here. Under common law, subject matter and quantity probably would not have been enough to make that offer definite enough. You would need more in order to have an offer to have someone accept and to form a contract. But under the UCC, all that has to be stated is a subject matter, like what we're selling and how many. Things like price and how long the contract will last can be supplied by the UCC if the parties do not actually put it in their contract. Firm offer. We didn't have this term exactly in the common law. A firm offer is when you have an offer that's being held open for a stated time. Under common law, the thing that was akin to that was, an offeror could make a promise to keep an offer open for a stated time, but they could actually revoke it at any time up until it was accepted, unless the offeree had paid to keep the offer open, had given consideration to keep the offer open. Under the UCC, because typically the UCC was designed to help business be run more efficiently, and we're trying to help business transactions move smoothly, you don't have to have consideration. We can have what's called a merchant's firm offer, which is an offer that is promised to be kept open for a specific period of time, and it cannot be revoked if the following three things occur. If the offer expresses an intent that it'll be kept open, in other words, the firm offer states offer to be held open for 30 days, that offer is put in writing, and it is signed by a merchant. So in order for a firm offer to be made, it has to be made by a merchant. What's a merchant? A person who is in the business of selling whatever the subject matter of this transaction is. So if I am a retailer, I'm Target, and I'm buying cell phones, if the cell phones are being offered to me by a company that's in the business of making cell phones, like Samsung, when they send me an offer saying, we will sell you 10 cases of cell phones for $10,000. You've got 30 days to respond. When they put that in writing, they put the time in, and then it's signed by, an officer of Samsung, i.e. signed by the merchant. Then that's a merchant's firm offer, and it cannot be revoked, and the buyer has the full 30 days in which to respond, and they don't have to give consideration for it. We've got our offer. Now, what about accepting that offer? Under the common law, we had this notion of the mirror image rule, that in order for an offeree to accept an offer, the offeree had to accept the identical terms that were made in the offer. Mirror image, your acceptance had to mirror the offer. Any additional terms that you might put in your acceptance would be considered a rejection of the offer, and no contract would be formed. Well, the UCC gets rid of that rule. There is no mirror image rule. The UCC takes the position that we're trying to do business. We want to see a contract be formed. We want to make it easy for people to get together and make money. So if we're talking about two merchants, if the seller and the buyer are both merchants, then additional terms that might be contained in acceptance automatically become part of the contract unless the other party objects to them within a reasonable time. So if Samsung sends the offer to sell to Target 10 cases of phones for $10,000. If Target responds and says, we'll buy the cases for $10,000, but we would like to have 40 days to make the payment. Those are additional terms, or you could argue those are additional terms. Unless the seller, Samsung, objects within a reasonable time, those additional terms that Target, the buyer, put in their acceptance automatically become part of the contract. So this UCC is trying to help the parties actually form a contract. Now, if we have a non-merchant involved, for instance, let's say it's Samsung selling, well, now let's not do Samsung because this wouldn't happen. Let's say it's between Target and a non-merchant. Target is selling goods and the buyer is not a merchant, and there are additional terms come in. Those additional terms do not automatically become part of the contract, but they don't kill the offer like they would have under common law. They are considered proposals. The additional terms are considered a proposal that the other party must decide whether or not to accept, but we still have a contract. Again, what's happening here? Under the UCC, we want to see a contract formed. So the acceptance does not have to mirror the offer. Between two merchants, additional terms automatically become part of the contract unless objected to. If you've got a non-merchant on one of the sides, then the additional terms are proposals that the other party must accept, but they still have a contract. But what if the terms that come into the acceptance are not merely additional, but they're conflicting? They're conflicting. So what would be an example of that? Let's say Samsung offers to sell Target goods for $10,000 and they say that the payment should be made within 30 days. And Target responds, we will buy the goods for $10,000, but we will pay them in 35 days. That term, 35 days, actually directly conflicts with the offer to have it paid within 30 days. When you have terms that you can't do both, either you're going to pay in 30 days or you're going to pay in 35, then you would say those are conflicting. Under the common law, we clearly would not have a contract because that change in terms would be a counteroffer and a rejection of the original offer. But under the UCC, even when the acceptance contains conflicting terms, we still have a contract. But those conflicting terms do not become part of the contract. What happens is that the contract is formed, but the conflicting terms cancel each other out, and the missing terms are supplied by the UCC. So in our example, Samsung wants payment in 30 days, net 30. Target wants to pay net 35. Those terms conflict. They cancel each other out, and so there's a contract for the purchase of goods for $10,000, but the contract does not contain a time of payment. So what would happen? You would look to the UCC. So the UCC, in which you can find in the back of your book, and if you look there, you will find that under the UCC, payment is due when the goods are delivered or tendered to the buyer. So in this case, when Target puts in their conflicting term and tries to get themselves more time, that's going to cancel out Samsung's offer of 30 days, and the UCC is going to require that those goods be paid for immediately. What about a writing? You will recall that there are certain types of contracts that have to be in writing in order to satisfy the statute of frauds. And that means in order to prevent fraud, certain types of contracts must be in writing. And one of them was a sale of goods of $500 or more. That is the current law. Under the revised UCC, the law will increase to $5,000. But interestingly, the revised UCC has not been adopted by all the states. So the current rule that's still in effect is that a writing is required for a contract for the sale of goods of $500 or more, unless we have an exception. So all contracts for sales of goods of $500 or more need to be in writing, unless the contract is for specially manufactured goods, think custom, or the contract has been admitted under oath, in other words, in discovery or in a pleading, or you have a situation where a party has received and accepted the goods, well, then they can no longer claim that there was no contract because it wasn't in writing, or payment for the goods has been made. Again, if you paid for the goods, you can't then claim that there was no contract. Finally, our confirming memorandum rule, this fits together with our statute of frauds. When we've got two merchants, there is an exception to the general requirement of the signature under the statute of frauds. A merchant's confirming memorandum sent by one merchant to another results in a binding and enforceable contract against all the parties unless the other merchant receiving that memorandum objects within 10 days. Now, let's go back for a second. When we learned about the statute of frauds in legal environment, you learned that if you've got one of the 7 categories of contracts that has to be put in writing, the writing must contain all the essential elements of the contract and the signature of the party that you intend to hold to the contract, the party to be bound. Right? So if you want to enforce the contract against Target, then a representative of Target had to have signed the contract. If you wanted to enforce the contract against Samsung, then a representative of Samsung would have had to have signed the contract. But this confirming memorandum rule is an exception. It says when we have a contract between 2 merchants like Samsung and Target, when only one merchant signs the contract, it's going to work to hold all the parties to the deal unless the other party who didn't sign objects within 10 days. Why is this exception here? I want you to think about the whole purpose of the UCC. We have this exception here because the UCC contemplates we are trying to do business. We've got sophisticated parties who are trying to transact business, probably interstate commerce type of business, and they don't have time to sign all these different things. They don't have to have all of the details spelled out. They know what they're trying to do. So as long as nobody objects within the time frame, we are going to accept the original offer, an original memorandum that one of the merchants proposed. The UCC is trying to make it more efficient and easier to transact business, so it relaxes a lot of the requirements of the common law.